The Santa Cruz Islands, located approximately 250 miles southeast of the Solomons, played an important role in the first year of the Pacific War. In early August 1942, a patrol from the U.S. 2nd Marines scouted the islands to establish a support base for Guadalcanal. The U.S. Navy assigned seaplane tenders there to service PBY patrol squadrons. A false Australian radio report on the 23rd of January 1942, claiming the Japanese had occupied Quieta, had repercussions even in isolated Vanikoro, the second largest of the small Santa Cruz Islands. Vanikoro had a pre-war population of a few dozen whites who worked either at the government station at Pio or for the Kauri Timber Company, a Melbourne concern logging the island's 117 square miles of forest since 1923. The diminutive town of Pio consisted of the district officer's headquarters, accommodations for the timber company employees, some native huts, and Frederick J. Jones's trading station. All communication with the outside world was by radio, and mail was delivered and dispatched when a ship arrived to pick up a cargo of the tall Kauri timber. With the Quieta scare, the handful of non-native timber workers made plans to leave on the company's vessels at the earliest opportunity. The district officer had organized an Eastern Solomons evacuation party that left AOLA Guadalcanal on the 17th of February for Port Vila, Efate Island, aboard the 80-foot schooner Ruana. The group included 2 men named Williamson and Roberts from Gold Ridge, as well as Bob Symes, Johnstone, Olson, 5 Chinese, and 3 individuals not named. They reached Port Vila on the 26th. 2 months later, in April, a party of 11 left Pio, Vanikoro, Santa Cruz Islands on board Fred Jones's 45-foot cutter, Quand Meme, a grueling trip that took 16 days. When the ship finally reached Vila Harbour, the passengers were so seasick that none could go ashore until several hours later. On the 27th of May, they boarded the Manura for Australia, joining a detachment of commandos, air personnel from the base, soldiers, airmen from Vila, and some evacuees from Bougainville. When Martin Clemens arrived on Tulagi in February, Resident Commissioner Marchant had asked if he would consider reopening the Gizo district. Clemens could not see a practical reason for doing so, as the Japanese were 440 miles from Gizo Island. Marchant then suggested that Clemens join Dick Horton and Henry Jocelyn at the AOLA station on Guadalcanal. Although Clemens felt this was unwise, he felt he had no choice. Clemens had been on Guadalcanal only once before, so he was glad to have Horton to show him the ropes. However, Horton was determined to join the Australian Navy, knowing someone would need to guide the Japanese invasion force should they advance east. By the 12th of February, Horton was already planning to leave the island at the first opportunity, which did not arise until early March, when he and Jocelyn finally departed. Clemens had been hurried off Tulagi Island to AOLA with nothing but what he was wearing. No baggage had been unloaded from the Marinda, and even his toothbrush went back to Australia. Fortunately, the deserted Burns Philp store at Macambo Island had not yet been completely plundered. In a letter from AOLA in March 1942, Clemens described the situation. It appears also that McFarlane and Pilot Officer Clive M. Hamer, in charge of the airbase, had quite divergent ideas as to what was to be done, and there was a complete lack of cooperation. The RC, Resident Commissioner, has stuck his head in the sand and said that the Japanese would never come here. In fact, he still believes it. We are getting a weekly raid over Tulagi. If Resident Commissioner Marchant believed the Japanese would not reach Tulagi, he had not examined a map of the South Pacific. With its excellent harbour, Tulagi was an ideal location for an advanced base, lying only 600 miles from Rabaul, which was becoming a major Japanese base in the South Pacific. Additionally, the major Japanese naval base at Truk Atoll in the Carolines was within flying distance of Tulagi. Clemens remained at AOLA, carrying out coast-watching operations and administrative functions in the Guadalcanal district until May 1942. When Japanese naval forces landed on Tulagi and invaded Guadalcanal in June, Clemens had to move into the rugged hinterland. During this time, some Chinese residents, having lived in isolation, were disoriented outside their community. Those who wanted to evacuate were eager for help but contributed little. Additionally, Clemens had to address a case where a native had axed an old prospector to death and had to host a German doctor and his wife, Dr. and Mrs. BFK Croning, as well as other Bougainville refugees. Compounding the frustration, Clemens had to deal with a crusty World War I veteran, F. Ashton's Snowy Rhodes, who had decided to remain on Guadalcanal. Rhodes, later commissioned in the Australian Navy as a coast watcher and aide to Macfarlane, spread unfounded rumours, including one about Japanese dogs being brought to hunt down whites. Clemens also worried about missionaries whom he could not convince to leave. 2 other district officers had drawn plum assignments, though they were unaware of it at the time. Was sent to San Cristobal in the Eastern Solomons, where was headquartered at Vanikoro in the Santa Cruz group. The Vanikoro office did not close until 1944, and even then the post office remained open, dispatching mail when vessels were in port or sailing to the New Hebrides. Neither district was ever bothered by the Japanese. However, on Efate on the 26th of February, the Ruana was loaned to the Australian government to carry materiel to the Australian Commando Detachment at Buka. Loaded with relief supplies, she left on the 27th with Jack Webster, a resident of Port Vila, as her skipper. On board were 3 commandos from the Numpel 2 section and Len Stevens of the New Hebrides Volunteer Defence Corps. They arranged to meet the schooner Malaguna off Facey in the Shortland Islands. The Ruana travelled by night and hid by day to avoid the Japanese. She was frequently under sail, as her engine kept breaking down, and when she ran aground on a reef one night, the crew had to jettison some heavy gear to float free. On the 13th of March 1942, Lieutenant Jack Mackey, Colorado of No. 3 Section No. 1 Independent Company, received a message that a cat would arrive from Tulagi at Faisi that evening to evacuate their medical technician, Sergeant Arthur Leyden, who had diagnosed himself with acute appendicitis. It was pitch dark, and we could not proceed. We departed Buin, Bougainville at 0300 in the schooner Malaguna with Father Richard O'Sullivan as pilot and 2 German internees on board. Mackey had me arrest the doctor and Mrs. BFK Croning. The German doctor had been a well-known figure at Quieta since the First World War, but due to his empathy with the Nazis' movement, he presented a threat to the Bougainville commandos. Croning did manage to assist in preventing further looting of Quieta by the natives when the district officer abruptly departed, yet this was not sufficient allegiance to deter his arrest. We acquired 2 well-known Bougainville planters, A. Drummond Thompson of Numa Numa and Wallace Washington Brown of Bonis, for evacuation. In the Malaguna were sapper Douglas Otten, Private Bernard Swanson, and myself. We arrived at Faisi at 0630 and found the cat waiting. Mackey went across with our medical technician in a canoe to meet the plane. He found Lieutenant Don Russell aboard. The 2 section commanders met for about 30 minutes. A little after 0700, the cat took off and returned to Tulagi. The Ruana finally arrived in the Shortlands, close by Bougainville, at 1500 on the 16th of March, and the troopers began transferring stores and ammunition to the Malaguna. The Cronings were handed over to the Ruana's crew. At 0330 on the 17th, the schooner headed back to Bougainville. Instead of returning to Efate, the Ruana set off for Aole on Guadalcanal. Jack Webster, the skipper, now also had with him Thompson, Brown, and the 2 Germans. Making her way from the Shortlands through enemy-controlled waters, the Ruana arrived at Clemens's Aola district station at 1700 on the 18th of March. The next day, she left for Auki in Maleta. At this time of upheaval, for some miners in the interior of Guadalcanal, the allure of gold may have been more compelling than their safety. They had ignored the possibility of a Japanese invasion until it was too late, then had retreated to the 2 500-foot-high Gold Ridge and the upper reaches of the Sorvohio and Sarivonga rivers. Fred M. Campbell and his sons, Jack and Pat, along with Bert Freshwater and Ken Hay, were living in relative luxury, thanks to the Burns Filp provisions from Macambo. However, with the enemy now nearing Tulagi, the Gold Ridge occupants were getting a bit restless. They could hear the Coast Watcher reports over their radio and the cat's warning messages sent back to Gavutu. Kelemendi Nabunosuno, who worked for the Guadalcanal Sluicing and Dredging Company, and Don McFarlane picked up a Coast Watcher message on McFarlane's teleradio. The district officer on Santa Isabel, Donald Kennedy, reported that a Japanese convoy had entered Thousand Ships Bay there 2 hours earlier and departed after a short period, apparently satisfied that it was not occupied by Allied troops. The bombing of the Australian military installations by the Japanese flying boats had become an all-too regular occurrence. The Tulagi AOB did not suffer a great deal of damage, but one bomb did demolish the mess hall, and with it the eating utensils and furniture. Fortunately, the Australians could borrow many household items in Tulagi town. They located the needed china and cooking utensils among the abandoned buildings. On the 5th of January, Clifford Searle arrived at Tulagi AOB by air from Port Moresby. While at the base, he was promoted to leading aircraft man. Cliff's diary describes a bombing attack. The Wanaka, the AIF-RAAF supply vessel, arrived after the morning bombing raid, and her captain was insistent on leaving Hell's Islands early the same night to avoid the raid expected the following morning. Hastily, Father Wall and I contacted the islanders on Florida Island, and they turned out in force to help unload the petrol and reload the ship with hundreds of empty drums. Work went on without ceasing until after dark, and when it was done, we were completely exhausted. Pilot Officer Hamer and Lieutenant Russell had arranged for the vessel to take some of the soldiers who were unfit back with her, and also a group of civilians who had escaped from Bougainville. They had travelled 500 miles to Tulagi, mostly at night, in a small and unreliable motorboat, in constant danger of capture by the Japanese. Searle spent all night in the rain, supervising native labourers as they rolled drums of petrol to the storage site. The Wanaka also brought a new, larger crash boat, as well as parcels, newspapers and letters. One of the Bougainville evacuees was Rolfe Cambridge, who had often taken care of the Catalina crews at Sorocan Plantation. At the request of headquarters, Cambridge was taken off MV Wanaka's manifest and ordered aboard a flying boat as a special passenger. He was flown to Port Moresby and later to Rathmines Air Station. The Wanaka's arrival at Tulagi had offered an ideal opportunity for Dick Horton, the former district officer on Guadalcanal, to bug out and join the military service when he reached Sydney, but he almost did not get off Tulagi that day. The Wanaka had just pulled away from the wharf and started moving down the channel when a Japanese flying boat spotted her and began a bombing run. As usual, and luckily, the Japanese crew missed and the Wanaka continued on. Horton would return to Tulagi 4 months later as a guide for the 1st Marine Raider Battalion. Near the end of February 1942, Father George Lepping, who had come to Tulagi with the refugee fleet, had returned to the Shortland Islands with some supplies, intent on resuming his work at Nila on Poporang Island. There he found Father Maurice Boch, who had come down from Quieta in Father Lepping's absence. Boch had heard that the mission was unoccupied and meant to keep it going. The Right Reverend Thomas J. Wade, the American who headed the Vicariate Apostolic of the Northern Solomon Islands, arrived at the beginning of March. He decided that both missionaries should stay at Tulagi. On the 30th of March, the Japanese occupied the Shortland Islands. They interrogated the priests and confined them to the mission station. 7 days later, a small vessel, the Laru, arrived at Faisi Harbour. Aboard were her owner, John Clouk, Hugh Wheatley and J. Alengi. Wheatley and Alengi were native dressers, persons trained in basic medical care, from Wanawana, New Georgia. They had been sent by District Officer Kennedy, ostensibly to deal with an influenza epidemic, but also to bring fuel for use on boats for coast-watching missions on Shortland and Faroe Islands. According to Father Lepping, when Kennedy had stopped at Nila on the 29th, he had stated explicitly that the fuel was to be distributed from the mission station. Presumably Kennedy had requisitioned the Laru for the task, as Clouk told Lepping that he had orders to go directly to Nila. Several accounts also mention that Wheatley brought a teleradio. On their arrival at Nila, however, the men were captured by the Japanese, who ordered them to stay at the mission. A correspondence began between Wheatley and the Japanese commander, Captain Asada, but it ended in August when the priests, Clowker and Wheatley were arrested and taken away. Hugh Wheatley and John Clowk were never seen again. Wheatley was sent to Rabaul, but the day before he left he gave a bottle to Allengi, telling him to hide it until someone from the government came to the Shortlands. The bottle remained hidden for 3 years until September 1945, when Allengi retrieved it and gave it to the Assistant Solomon District Commissioner, Lieutenant S. Bolton, who was on an administrative trip to the Shortlands. The bottle contained a small roll covered with sticking plaster. Written on the outside were Diary H. Wheatley, NMP, Native Medical Practitioner, and the date. Allengi identified the diarist as Hugh Wheatley. Another intrepid evacuation holdout in the islands was Emily Sprott, who had been in sole charge of the Melanesian mission station on Maranatabu off Santa Isabel since her husband's death from malaria in 1924. In April 1942, Mrs. Sprott went bush rather than evacuate. Although her food ran out in June and the medical supplies even earlier, she was able to hide out for 10 months thanks to loyal islanders who had cached provisions in several different places. In the strike of the 30th of April 1942, the Japanese dropped 26 bombs on Tulagi, damaging 2 Catalinas. Coast watcher Leif Schroeder on Savo Island, 20 miles away, had sent an urgent message that enemy aircraft were on the hunt, and thus Eric Townsend and Terry Eakins hurried to get their cats airborne. Townsend was in the advanced stages of lifting off, and Eakins was about to follow when both got hit. The instrument panel on Eakins's A2419 was totally battered. Nevertheless, on the following day, Townsend was able to get the plane airborne at 0300 and fly it to Rathmines, New South Wales, for repairs. He landed at 17:30, having gone the distance entirely without instruments, an exceptional feat. Catalina, a 24-23, had mainframe damage and was unable to take off, so the remaining crash boat pulled it to Aoole to save the plane from certain destruction. It was hoped the Cat could be repaired there with a mainframe obtained from Port Moresby. Commando Howard J. Roberts was involved in the preparations for the demolition of the military installations on Gavutu and Tanambogo. His Tulagi Advanced Operational Base Activities report notes, Nome 1. Sections training was concentrated on methods of demolition so that everything could be destroyed if we were ordered to move out. It was found that the best method of demolishing the normal timber houses and buildings was to use a 5-gallon drum of petrol with 2 sticks of gelignite strapped to it. When the gelignite exploded, the house or building was instantly ablaze. This method was applied to all the houses, offices and stores on Gavutu and Tanambogo. As of the 29th of April, detonators had not yet been placed in the explosive devices, but Cortex instantaneous fuse had been used to centralize each section. The Cortex was connected to a normal safety fuse, and each section was to be connected to a 1-hour time pencil. Early in the morning on the 1st of May, the Tulagi AOB on Gavutu and Tanambogo Islands was attacked by Japanese flying boats. It was attacked again at 0930 by 2 floatplane fighters, the Nakajima A6M2N, codenamed the Roof by the Allies, and was hammered intermittently throughout the day. In the late afternoon, 3 RAAF Catalinas arrived. Meanwhile, Sergeant C.W. Bill Miller, piloting Cat A 2417, sighted a 5-ship Japanese task force just south of the New Georgia Islands heading for the Southern Solomons. His report at 1300 to Gavutu gave the camp time to scramble and make last-minute arrangements to destroy the installations and set evacuation plans. Cliff Searle topped off the Catalinas with petrol and bombs, and he and the crews wished each other good luck. One Cat, flown by a pilot named Hurst, was airborne at 1827 that evening, heading for the expected sighting zone of the Japanese task force. At 0422 on the 2nd of May, he sighted and attacked 2 merchant vessels, but failed to make a hit, and the Japanese continued to head south toward Tulagi. Hurst landed at Port Moresby at 1200, having flown 42 hours in less than 2 days. Flying Officer Norman took off at 0450 to conduct searches between Tulagi and Port Moresby. Sergeant Miller followed at 0600. Just after becoming airborne, Miller saw the first wave of enemy planes start their bombing run on the base. His was the last aircraft out of the Tulagi area. The Australians had two plans for evacuation in the event of a Japanese invasion. One was to move from Gavutu and Tanambogo to Florida Island and then follow the government trails to the east end of the island in the hope that they could be plucked from there. The other plan was to slip out in the 80-ton motor vessel Belus, which had been hidden in the Florida mangroves for just such a move, her mast covered daily with fresh palm branches. At 1100 on the 2nd of May, the Tulagi Air Base received a message from Port Moresby stating that sufficient fuel should be saved in the event that it was needed later. Then came orders to demolish the base and withdraw to Florida Island. The alarm bell clanged harshly, and the Australians put their escape plans into effect. As darkness fell, a heavy thunderstorm burst upon the islands. The Australians activated the charges and moved out of Gavutu. In his diary, Cliff Searle recorded the evacuation of the airmen. We decided to leave the base, as the Japanese were only 60 miles away, took Betty Jane, petrol barge, bomb scow, and all the chaps to Halavo. Just reached the shore at 0630 when over came the Japanese bombers. We ran for the jungle. They dropped bombs, repeated attack, then float fighter planes sank our crash boat with cannon fire. Leading aircraftsmen Keith Robinson and Peter swam ashore. I went back to the base on the scow to get the CO, Flying Officer Pegum, who had arrived on the 20th of April, and the 4 remaining wireless operators. More fighters came over bombing our island. We got to Halavo in the scow with secret gear, also the wireless. Another fighter overhead at 1745. We prepared for scorched earth system, 20-30 fires going everywhere. I stayed behind with an army chap and blew up a bomb dump, 22:30. We remaining chaps travelled 3 miles in the scow and petrol barge to a track which would lead us to the Ballus. Blew up petrol barge and 1,700 gallons of petrol, scuttled bomb scow, and left at 0200 hours for AOLA. Howard Roberts tells of the evacuation of the commandos. We had travelled less than a half mile when our engine cut out in very rough weather conditions and resisted all efforts to restart. It was found out that when the fuel tank had been filled, the cover for the fuel inlet had not been replaced, and consequently we had water in our fuel. While we were working out the problem, the Tanambogo boat appeared out of the gloom. We abandoned our boat and continued toward Bolly Passage. Considering that it was pitch black, a rough sea and blinding rain, in an area of 4 square miles of sea, the odds of 2 small boats almost colliding were incalculable. Shortly afterward, the demolition charges started, and even though the storm still raged, the explosions and fires were awe-inspiring, viewed from a distance of approximately 1.5 miles, with an amazing reflection from the low storm clouds. From Florida Island, the Australians travelled to Morau Sound, at the southeastern end of Guadalcanal. There they picked up the 19 commandos who had gone out the back door of the base, almost as the Japanese were coming in the front. With everyone on board the Balus except the crew who had taken the damaged Catalina to AOLA, the boat headed for San Cristobal, arriving at Mora Bay on the 5th of May and Star Harbour the next day. There they waited for the Loai, carrying some civilians and the crew from the A-2423, except Lieutenant Eakins, to join them. The surviving crash boat, piloted by LAC Keith Robinson, towed the A-2423 across Sealark Channel to Aola on the north coast of Guadalcanal. 400 Solomon Islanders pulled the bulky plane as far inland as they could. The radio was removed and used by the evacuation party to communicate with their base in Vila. By that time, the Kura 3rd Special Naval Landing Force was occupying what had been the Tulagi Advanced Operational Base, Gavutu, and Tanambogo. Airman Kevin Landers recorded his impressions in his diary. The trip of the Balus from Guadalcanal to San Cristobal had some tense moments. The worst was when she was spotted by a Japanese flying boat. We were well briefed on intelligence reports that there was little chance of survival if captured. The Japanese Kawanishi circled us at 200–300 feet and about 1,000 yards, adjusting its armament as it circled, and the crews were very visible. They did not know they had the total Tulagi garrison of 53 and 6 native crew members at their mercy. We had native crew up in the rigging waving frantically, and I recall a large bunch of bananas swinging from the rigging and the majority of us huddled under the mainsail on the foredeck. The situation lasted 20 minutes, it seemed like hours, and it appeared they were in touch with command and had identified us as a local native boat. They wanted to keep the natives on their side and had let us off. Fortunately, everyone exercised great discipline, as I'm sure the main urge would have been to go over the side and take a chance of reaching the shore of Guadalcanal some 3 miles away. There was a feeling of great relief when the aircraft turned away. The Kawanishi had been searching for the U.S. Navy task force that on the previous day had bombed the Japanese on Tulagi, but a Navy fighter from the carrier Yorktown, CV-5, knocked down the Kawanishi before she could report the group's position. The Balus, meanwhile, chugged along at 8 knots, with Charles Bird, a government boatswain, at the helm assisted by LAC Keith Robinson. Navigation duties fell to P.O. Bob Byrne, the navigator of Catalina A 2423. The Balus reached Maura Bay, San Cristobal, on the 6th of May and departed at dusk for the New Hebrides. On the 9th, the party landed at Espiritu Santo. After resting, they pushed south, aiming to reach Vila on the 14th. Yet their trials were not over. Nearing Efate, the little ship was eyed by 2 OS-2 U Kingfisher aircraft from U.S. Navy Scouting Squadron VS-55, possibly off the heavy cruiser Chicago, CA-29, or the Chester, CA-27. According to Howard Roberts, as we approached Efate, we were challenged by 2 American floatplanes that were very aggressive and fired a warning burst as they approached. It all looked a little grim until the Australian flag was unfurled. They obviously reported us by radio, and we were given clearance because they gave us no more trouble. The Kingfishers waggled their wings, and our vessel went on its merry way. There was another danger, however. The authorities at Espiritu Santo had neglected to inform the evacuees that Vila Harbour was mined. Fortunately, according to Keith Robinson, the Balus had a wooden hull and thus passed undetected directly over the mines. Had she been of steel construction, he notes, the tale would have ended differently. About the time the Australian commandos and airmen made their abrupt departure from their base on the 3rd of May, Charles Bignell, who owned Fulacora Plantation on Santa Isabel and managed a small concession in trading goods, decided that it was time to leave Dot. He chose to sail for the New Hebrides in his schooner, Valère, in company with Harold Beck from Gizo, Roy Gorringe from Santa Isabel, and 22 Chinese. Upon reaching Espiritu Santo, Bignell headed for the more civilized town of Port Vila in Hells Islands, where the United States had recently established an advance base. He offloaded his passengers, sold his vessel to a French planter, and eventually obtained a commission in the U.S. Navy. The first vessel under Lieutenant Bignell's command was the Resolution, a 150-ton former Burns-Philp inter-island schooner. Bignell's chief mission was the transport of military cargo and supplies to the scattered islands of the New Hebrides and as far north as Vanikoro in the Santa Cruz group. Back on Guadalcanal, Martin Clemens allowed 2 days for the evacuation party to be well out of the area. Then he ignited the 6 sticks of dynamite that LAC Duncan Ridley had placed around the damaged Catalina. The explosive was old and damp, and the entire charge did not detonate. The plane was only partially destroyed, but the locals went about hacking the remainder to pieces with machetes and threw many chunks into the ocean. Meanwhile, 3 civilians, A. Chant, Bill Binskin, and Lou Moontak, had escaped just ahead of the Japanese in the Hygeia, the government health officer's vessel. At AOLA, Clemens arranged for the Hygeia to take some civilians and the 7 airmen who had helped tow the A-2423 to Malaita. At Auki, they were supposed to meet with the Marinda, which was expected to arrive shortly to pick up the remaining evacuees. However, the Marinda never left Sydney. The Solomon Island government had failed to inform Clemens and other concerned parties that she was not coming again to the Protectorate. A message to that effect was finally received from Auki. At 0300 on the 8th of May, 8 vessels left Su'u for Maramasike Passage, arriving there at noon. They travelled south to Port Vila under cover of darkness most of the way. Other than spotting a Japanese flying boat on the 10th and suffering engine trouble 3 times on the morning of the 14th, the trip was completed without incident. At Vanikoro on the 15th, they delivered and picked up mail, purchased needed stores, and took on 2 more passengers, former employees of the timber company. At 1700 on the 19th, not far from Vila, 2 American planes flew overhead. The vessels could not make port before dark, so they signalled for a pilot boat and were met by American destroyers. After questioning, the small boats were directed toward lights in the harbour. A pinnace off one destroyer came alongside with a boarding party, and after inspection, the Hygeia was directed to an anchorage for the night. Much of the next day was spent on shore, then everyone except the Chinese was placed on board the Manura, which sailed for Sydney at 16:30. She arrived there at 1000 on the 25th of May 1942. The Hygeia was left in the charge of the resident commissioner at Port Vila, and the Chinese returned to Malaita, where they set up a settlement in the hinterland and remained there during most of the war. It is interesting that 4 U.S. Navy men were the first Americans to set foot on Guadalcanal during the war, and not the U.S. Marines. Lieutenant Leonard H. Ewalt, Lieutenant J.G. T. Scott McCuskey, and Ian's John P. Adams were part of the air task force that struck Tulagi on the 4th of May. All had run out of fuel. Brother James Thrift, from the Roman Catholic mission at Morau Sound, brought Lieutenant Ewalt and his radio man, Ray Machalinsky, to AOLA on the 13th in the Ramada. They had washed up off Anu, an island off Guadalcanal, after rowing in a raft for 3 days. They told Martin Clemens that 5 Japanese ships at Tulagi had been sunk, including a supply vessel that Ewalt had attacked and had seen go down near Savo. Ewalt's first words to Clemens were, "Would you please get us back to Pearl Harbor?" At about this time, Ironi Leauli, Clemens's Fijian medical assistant, had been on a trip to another part of Guadalcanal. He reported, 2 U.S. scout planes ashore at Cape Henslow abandoned, found parachutes, navigation boards, and rubber dinghy. These were McCuskey and Adams's F-4F Wildcat fighters. They were intact, but slightly damaged. The 2 officers had been rescued by a recovery boat from the U.S. Navy destroyer Hammond, DD 412. To their continued good fortune, and true to his word, Martin Clemens commandeered the Hing Li, formerly owned by a Chinese merchant at Tulagi. He shipped the airmen aboard the rickety craft to Auki on Malaita, where a few other passengers joined them, including Mr. A.J. Waite, a missionary from the South Sea Evangelical Mission on Malaita. The party reached Port Vila before the end of May. The 2 airmen returned to their carrier via the PBYs of U.S. Navy Patrol Squadron VP-23, attached to the seaplane tender Curtis, AV-4. The Hing Li remained at Vila and was later appropriated by the U.S. Army to run supplies to isolated garrisons in the New Hebrides. Clemens's newly arrived and unwelcome Japanese neighbours, who now occupied Tulagi, some 30 miles from his post, soon began constructing their own advance base. They gave Clemens a great deal to worry about. He wrote in his diary, "The Japanese could send a boat and be here in 2 hours." Fortunately, that never happened. Unlike its American and British counterparts, the Imperial Japanese Navy had its own generic infantry, the Rikusentai. The standard unit was the Special Naval Landing Force, SNLF, a flexible organization named after the naval base where the men were recruited, Kure, Maizuru, Sasebo, or Yokosuka. The Kure 3rd SNLF, Kaigun Kure Daisan Tokubetsu Rikusentai, was formed on the 2nd of February 1942 at the Naval Training Center, Kure Barracks. 95% of its personnel were reservists. The balance consisted of recent inductees and apprentice seamen. The unit was led by Sida Minoru Yano of Sasebo, a career officer. At 39, he was younger than most of the men in his charge. When Executive Officer Lieutenant Nagata read the muster roll that first day, 1,122 enlisted men and 44 officers answered. Their average age was 43. Some had not been on active duty since the 1920s, most likely as deep-water sailors on combatant ships where they were trained as deckhands or engineers. Since then, as reservists, they had attended regular drills and participated in 2 weeks of active duty training each year, but that was just to keep them proficient in the shipboard billets they had held. During the 2 weeks following the 2nd of February, the Kura 3rd went through a brief refresher course at Kura Barracks, but it was cut short when the unit was ordered to the field. The men did not have adequate time to work together, and the course was deficient in many ways. Yet, as the U.S. Marines would discover, the Rikusentai would prove to be skilled and tenacious adversaries. On the 17th of February, the men of the Kura 3rd boarded the MV Azuma-san Maru, a chartered transport that departed the Kure docks at 1700, headed for Truk in the Caroline Islands, headquarters of the Japanese Fourth Fleet. En route, she was attacked by a U.S. submarine that fired a spread of 5 fish. However, either as a result of her evasive maneuvers or because the torpedo warheads were defective, the vessel was unharmed. She arrived at Truk on the 20th. A week later, the entire 3rd SNLF complement began landing exercises. The Imperial Navy's amphibious warfare doctrine clearly needed modernization, especially the obsolete landing tactics. Sailors had practiced going down a single knotted rope called a Jacob's ladder, hand over hand, with knots spaced a foot apart. This primitive method of disembarking had gone out with the sailing ship, but it was still the Japanese way. Training continued until orders were received transferring the Kure 3rd SNLF to Rabaul, New Britain, 8th Base Force. The unit departed Truk aboard the Azuma-san Maru on the 16th of March and reached Rabaul 3 days later. On arrival, Commander Yano's men quickly settled into their barracks adjacent to spacious Simpson Harbour. After the fall of Rabaul on the 23rd of January, Major General Tomitaro Horai of the Imperial Japanese Army, commander of the South Seas Detachment, Nankai Shitai, had anticipated the quick occupation of Lae, codenamed RXM, and Salamaua, codenamed RXL, as well as the capture of Port Moresby. However, RAAF air raids on Rabaul had hampered the accomplishment of these goals. The Japanese did not move on eastern New Guinea until the 8th of March, when Lae was invaded by the main body of the RXM landing force, composed of part of the Rabaul-based 82nd Guard Unit, GU, with 2 platoons from the Sasebo 5th SNLF in support. The 14th Construction Unit was then transferred from Rabaul to build an advanced base at Lae. Salamaua was also taken by the RXL landing force, which consisted of elements of the 82nd Guard Unit, supported by 2 80mm anti-aircraft weapons from the 8th Base Force. In late March, the 47-man 5th Platoon, 1st Company, Kura 3rd SNLF, under W.O. Shigemasa Yamada, was divided into 2 units. The RXC landing force was sent to occupy Buka. The RWH landing force went to Shortland Bay, Fazy, Shortland Islands. Knowing that the territory of New Guinea was defended by only small numbers of Australian troops, the Japanese dispatched forces to handle them. On the 6th of April, 70 men from 2 platoons of the 1st Company, Kure 3rd SNLF, led by Espadrille Lieutenant J.G. Sakazo Takamura, were sent to occupy part of the Admiralty Islands. Other sections of the Kure 3rd and the Sasebo 5th SNLF went out on survey and patrol missions. The presence of only small naval ground forces at Rabaul and Truk implies that, contrary to Allied intelligence estimates, the Japanese did not then have significant numbers of men in the Pacific Islands. The largest army contingent was the South Seas Detachment, the force that took Rabaul. To support the Southeast Detachment, the official designation for the army forces at Rabaul, the Navy had to draw personnel from the Japanese-mandated islands and from Japan. These reinforcements arrived gradually, and by April 1942 they still numbered only a few thousand. However, with each passing week, Rabaul increased in strength. In the meantime, specialized units, primarily naval, began moving into Rabaul. Airfield construction units, Hikojo Setsuetai, began to rebuild some of the old Australian fields and assist the 7th Construction Unit in establishing new aerodromes around the town. One large construction unit was assigned to develop miles of fortified caves in the nearby mountains, while another began building the major military complex that Rabaul was soon to become. On the morning of the 18th of April 1942, Rabaul came under heavy air attack by B-17S of the U.S. Army Air Force's 19th Bombardment Group, Heavy, out of Townsville, Australia. The flying fortresses targeted the harbour and sank a transport, the MV Komaki Maru. When a warehouse bordering the dock was hit and set ablaze, Kura 3rd sailors stationed nearby were called out to help extinguish the fire. Some of the unit's supplies and equipment were stored in the dock area, and fearing this material would be destroyed, Commander Yano ordered it moved some distance away for safety. Bombs also struck the barracks of Lieutenant J.G. Katsutaro Makimura's 4th Company, leaving 3 men killed and 11 wounded. The Kure 3rd SNLF experienced a sudden and bloody introduction to the war. On the 23rd of April, action appeared imminent when Commander Yano received South Seas Fleet Operation Order No. 13, outlining plans for the invasion of Port Moresby, the MO operation, under the Commander 4th Fleet. The Japanese Navy's surface forces, commanded by Rear ADM Aritomo Goto, would provide direct support for the Army's South Seas Detachment, which was to invade Port Moresby on the 10th of May at 0600 with the heavy cruisers Ioba, Furutaka, Kako and Kinugasa, the light carrier Shoho and the destroyer Sazanami. General Hori's brigade was to be reinforced by core elements of the Kure 3rd SNLF, the 2nd and 3rd Companies, the Dobashi Transport Unit and the Chadani Medical Unit. To protect the eastern flank of this thrust, the Navy would occupy Tulagi and the De Boyne Islands, Louisiade Archipelago, where it would establish seaplane bases and consolidate its position for potential air operations against Australia. On the 28th of April, the troops embarked on the Azumasan Maru. The next day, on Emperor Hirohito's birthday, the contingent faced Japan, bowed, and prayed for the Emperor's health. The stubborn resistance from Allied aircraft defending Port Moresby, however, was forcing the Japanese to a strategic reassessment. Without control of the air, their naval forces would be at risk, and thus the 8th Base Force put a new plan in place. The Kure 3rd SNLF would now constitute the RXB landing force assigned to assault and occupy Tulagi Island. The Japanese did not know that the Americans were intercepting and deciphering a significant percentage of their naval message traffic, including communications related to the crucial MO operation. On May 1st, the U.S. Navy Combat Intelligence Center at Pearl Harbor, codenamed HIPO, broadcast a warning. MO campaign now underway, involves Southeast New Guinea and Louisiade Archipelago, suggest Moresby for MO. Forces engaged will consist of Cardiff 5, Crewdiv 5 Lesnachi, Crewdiv 18 and Desron 6, Gunboat Div 8, now called 19th Division, and New Britain Air, which is known as No. 5 Attack Force, consisting of Tainan Air Group, 4th Naval Flying Corps and Yokohama Air Group. At 19:30 on the 30th of April, elements of the Kure 3rd SNLF that had been slated to invade Port Moresby were officially reassigned as the RXB Landing Force, objective Tulagi Island. The Tulagi Invasion Task Force was under Rear ADM, Kyohide Shima's 19th Division. It included Admiral Shima's flagship, the large mine layer Okinoshima, transports Azumasan Maru and Tosan Maru, destroyers Kikazuki and Yuzuki from Desron 6, converted minesweepers Hagoromo Maru, Noshiro Maru No. 2, and Tama Maru from Minesweeper Division 14, sub-chasers Tama Maru No. 8 and Toshi Maru No. 3 from Anti-Submarine Boat Group 56, mine layer Koei Maru, and auxiliary minesweepers Wa-1 and Wa-2. The 54-man Mitsuwa Anti-Aircraft Unit, Mitsuwa Butai, under Spee Lieutenant J.G. Toshichi Mitsuwa, in company with the 132-man civilian Hashimoto Construction Force, Hashimoto Butai, under Shinya Hashimoto, had come to Rabaul from Palau. Both units boarded the Azuma-san Maru for transport to the Solomons in support of the Tulagi landing. The RXB landing force sailed initially southwest, curved to the east, continued down through the slot, then went directly to Tulagi. Intelligence reports were scanned for information. The General Staff Office directive noted, "The harbour on the north side of Tulagi is the best in these islands, and there are installations such as piers. At Macambo, there are warehouses and a pier. It is possible to dock a medium-sized ship." The directive added that Gavutu has a workshop for minor repairs, an oil reservoir, a warehouse, and a pier 67 metres long. However, the report noted, as a result of our bombing attacks, they have been damaged considerably. Upon receipt of the Tulagi invasion plans, the Kure 3rd SNLF elements involved were alerted for the landing. SP Lieutenant J.G. Junta Maruyama, commanding the 2nd Company, was placed in charge. The landing force consisted of Maruyama's 2nd Company and the 3rd Company, under Spee Lieutenant J.G. Kakichi Yoshimoto, reinforced by elements of the 1st Company, under Spee Lieutenant J.G. Sakazo Takamura, and supported by a detachment of the 7th Construction Unit and the Mitsuwa Anti-Aircraft Unit, previously on Truk. The 3 platoons of the 3rd Company would make up the garrison force. Lieutenant Maruyama wasted no time in issuing his first order to the RXB landing force. Besides identifying the resistance expected, it laid out the objectives and movements of men and equipment, not just for one landing site, but for an alternative as well. In the early evening hours of Saturday, the 2nd of May, searchlights of the Japanese naval escort vessels in the vicinity of Savo Island nervously scanned the water and the skies for Allied ships and aircraft. They had been warned that motor torpedo boats might be lurking in the area. Late that evening, the RXB force reached the outer fringes of Tulagi Island. After a general probe of the area by the minesweeping group, the force anchored in the harbour. Combat gear and personal baggage were quickly transferred to waiting landing craft, and at about midnight the landing force moved in. According to W.O. Takeo Iwata, commander of the 1st Platoon, 2nd Company, in practice the transports stood offshore about 3 miles, but in the RXB operation they came right into the harbour. 4 large landing boats, kokosukas, were carried on the MV Tozan Maru. Each could hold 100 to 150 men, but they were crowded with 150. Through the haze, the men of the Kure 3rd could see the fires burning on Gavutu and Tanambogo. They were determined to defeat the British and the Australians, Churchill's men, at every turn. SME Tameichi Shimamoto of the 4th Squad, 2nd Platoon, 1st Company, recorded his feelings before the landing. "We are going to carry out an opposed landing on Tulagi at 0100. It is before a fight, and there is not a tremble in our hearts. I believe the most beautiful part of a Japanese is this present mental state, transcending life and death." At 0010 on the 3rd of May, the operation began. The landing force consisted of 188 men from the 2nd Company and 210 from the 3rd Company. The 2nd Company debarked from the Tosan Maru in 3 Kosakuka landing craft. In the landing force, commander's boat were Headquarters Platoon, 1st Platoon, 1 section of 3rd Platoon, and company signallers. The other 2 boats held the 2nd Platoon, the remainder of 3rd Platoon, doctors, including Lieutenant Tatsumi Okawa, and stretcher-bearers. The 2nd Company's landing party was split between 2 craft, with 95 men in one boat and 93 in the other. The landing was made on the north side of Tulagi. However, because the high-speed Kosakukas had difficulty reaching the coast, most of Lieutenant Yoshimoto's men debarked in deep water and had to wade to shore. The Japanese had expected opposition, but their arrival was uncontested. SME Yodoyama Mori of the Tanaka platoon described the events. "We loaded our AT anti-tank guns on a large landing barge, so they would be available when we faced the enemy. We packed blankets, belongings, etc., and put our name on each one and were ready to unload at Gavutu and Tulagi. At 1500 on the 2nd of May, a mine-layer, Okinoshima, sailed in front of our vessel and reported it sighted an enemy seaplane. We recognized a foremast warship ahead, but it was a friendly ship. At 2400 hours, we sighted island Gavutu. Our SNLF gathered on the stern of the Azumasan Maru, and we saw something burning on the island. Our guard destroyers, Kikuzuki and Yuzuki, had stopped. Okinoshima and Azumasan Maru advanced. Our 120-130 men started to head for the coast in large landing craft. We placed bullets in our I-type rifles. Approaching the coast, 500 meters, 400 meters, 300 meters, 200 meters, and 100 meters, and then 50 meters, and carefully landed on pier. No resistance. It seems the enemy has escaped and burned their barracks. The Australians at Tulagi Air Base had withdrawn only 2 hours earlier. Seaman Engineer Mori described the first morning on Gavutu and Tulagi. We completely occupied Gavutu and Tulagi by 0415. The 7th Construction Unit, RXB Detachment, began unloading their equipment immediately and missed the ceremonies of being one of the first Japanese units to land in the British Solomon Islands. Before dawn, they were all ashore. The required equipment would arrive later once the garrison was settled. The 2 platoons raised the flag on Gavutu and prayed for the Celestial Emperor. We then went to the islet closest to Gavutu, Tanambogo, and waited until dawn. Sunrise was at 0605, and after the sun rose we inspected the enemy's barracks and arranged their weapons. On the 14th of April, U.S. Navy Task Force, TF-17, operating out of Noumea, New Caledonia, under Rear ADM. Frank J. Fletcher had been ordered to Tongatabu in the Tonga Group for replenishment and upkeep. 6 days later, Fletcher's force, including the carrier Yorktown, CV-5, heavy cruisers Astoria, CA-34, Chester, CA-27, and Portland, CA-33, and destroyers Anderson, DD-411, Hammond, DD-412, Morris, DD-417, Hells Islands, and Russell, DD-414. Joined destroyer tender Dobbin, AD-3, hospital ship Solace, AH-5, and the store ship Bridge, AF-1, in the spacious harbour of Tonga's capital, Nuku'alofa. Task Force 11 under Rear ADM. Aubrey W. Fitch with the carrier Lexington, CV-2, heavy cruisers Minneapolis, CA-36, and New Orleans, CA-32, and destroyers Alwyn, DD-355, Dewey, DD-349, Farragut, DD-348, Monaghan, DD-354, and Phelps, DD-360, had sailed from Pearl Harbor on the 15th of April. Fletcher sailed from Tongatabu on the 27th for a rendezvous with Fitch on the 1st of May, about 250 miles west of Espiritu Santo. From Australian Task Force 44, Rear ADM, J.G. Crace of the Royal Navy, along with the heavy cruiser Chicago, CA-29, destroyer Perkins, DD-377, and oiler Tippecanoe, AO-21, would depart Noumea in time to meet Fletcher at the rendezvous point. The oiler Neosho, AO-23, shepherded by the destroyer Sims, DD-409, handled fueling chores for Fletcher's TF-17, the Tippecanoe, escorted by the destroyer Warden, DD-352, supported Fitch's TF-11. Admiral Crace, with the heavy cruiser HMAS Australia, light cruiser HMAS Hobart, and U.S. Navy destroyer Whipple, DD-217, left Sydney on the 1st of May to rendezvous with Admiral Fletcher in the Coral Sea on the morning of the 4th. At 1300 on the 1st of May, Ray A.F. Catalina, a 2417 piloted by Sergeant C.W. Miller, sighted 5 Japanese vessels heading for Tulagi. Admiral Fletcher ordered an attack on Tulagi harbour. However, the sergeant was not given permission to bomb the invasion force, even though his plane drew anti-aircraft fire. 2 hours after sunrise on the 4th, having just landed some 8 hours earlier, rear ADM. Kiyohide Shima's flagship, Okinoshima, was riding at anchor close to shore while unloading. The Yorktown's SBD Dauntless dive bombers started their descent from 19,000 feet. 12 TBD Devastators followed on a torpedo run. They plastered the Japanese force with every weapon they possessed. In a second attack, between 10:30 and 11:20, the Yorktown launched all 38 planes to pound Tulagi and the offshore roadstead. At that time, the Okinoshima was anchored next to the Yuzuki, with the Kikuzuki moored about 200 yards to the east. Under attack, the vessels headed out of the harbour, led by the Okinoshima. Left behind were the Kikuzuki, the Division 14 minesweepers Tama Maru, Hagoromo Maru, and Noshiro Maru No. 2, and the sub-chasers Toshi Maru No. 3 and Tama Maru No. 8. Mavis flying boats from the Yokohama Air Group had arrived recently and were riding at anchor off Gavutu. They, as well as most of their crews, were lost in the air attack. Keeping the American bandits somewhat at bay were the Azumasan Maru's gun crews, firing their 2 75mm anti-aircraft weapons and 4 machine guns. Sailors of Yoshimoto's 3rd Company had been unloading cargo from the transport at the time of the attack. 7 were wounded and 3 killed. No member of the Kure 3rd on land died, but 29 were wounded. The gun crew from the Mitsuwa Butai, anti-aircraft unit, on Gavutu was untouched. On Tulagi, the AA unit fired its 8-cylindrical guns from Hill 281, called Toridai, Bird Hill, by the Japanese, but none of the attacking aircraft were hit. When the assault was over, the Yoshimoto Company sent barges from Tulagi to rescue survivors, collecting those who were swimming. Floating bodies were picked up and returned to Tulagi, and after being prepared, the dead were consumed in a funeral pyre, while members of the unit chanted and said prayers for their departed countrymen. The Japanese suffered additional losses at sea that day as well. From the Tama Maru No. 8, 1 man was killed and 4 wounded. Minesweeper Tama Maru, which was sunk, had 4 killed and 7 wounded. The Ichigo, also sunk, reported 20 killed and 6 wounded. On the Nigo, 23 were killed and 14 wounded. On sister destroyer Yuzuki, 10 sailors were killed and 32 wounded. The Azumasan Maru suffered 4 men killed and 5 wounded. On the Takashima, 10 were wounded. Admiral Shima's flagship, Okinoshima, did not get away unscathed. Limping along, she dispatched a message to Rabaul that she was in trouble. Rabaul responded by sending the Shoei Maru and the Kinryu Maru. On the 11th of May, while being towed by the Kinryu Maru just west of Buka at the northern tip of Bougainville, the mine layer was finished off. The U.S. submarine S-42, in the charge of Lieutenant O.G. Kirk, sighted the wounded warship and sank her with 3 well-placed Mark IV torpedoes. 3 ships, the light cruiser Tenryu, heavy cruiser Keiko, and ARS Oshima, rescued most of the Japanese crew, as well as Admiral Shima. The following day, however, the Shoei Maru, on returning to Rabaul, was sunk by an old World War I sugar boat, SS-44, under Lieutenant J.R. Moore. The American pilots were excited by the opportunity to strike at the Japanese Navy, though they exaggerated the results, claiming to have sunk more vessels than existed in the Japanese force. A sailor on the cruiser Astoria during the 4th of May raid recorded the airmen's assertions. They came back an hour and a half later saying they had probably sunk 3 cruisers, 2 transports, and left 1 transport sinking. The second raid took place at 11 o'clock. In it they sank 2 cruisers, 1 cruiser capsized, the destroyer Kikuzuki, left 1 cruiser sinking and on fire, sunk 2 destroyers, strafed 3 patrol planes, and shot down 1 large vessel operating as a mine layer. The airmen also showed their unfamiliarity with enemy vessels, regularly mistaking one type for another. U.S. Navy observers and historians later argued that the results did not justify the tremendous amount of ammunition that was expended. Still, the strike provided valuable experience for the U.S. air crews, and a review of the actual losses is informative. Apparently it was decided that the task of guarding the Tulagi area was too extensive for Lieutenant Yoshimoto's 3rd Company, and thus 2 platoons of the 1st Company, the 1st Platoon under W.O. Yoshiharu Muranaka, and the 2nd Platoon under W.O. Katsuzo Fukimoto, were added to the garrison force. The balance of the 1st Company and the 2nd Company, less the Tanaka Platoon, returned to Rabaul. It was soon after the 4th of May air raid that the Kure 3rd SNLF took over the buildings vacated by the Tulagi evacuees. The Australians had partially burned the 4 former RAAF barracks on Tanambogo, but the Japanese scavenged enough building materials in Tulagi's Chinatown to repair them, even finding food and a working refrigerator stocked with cold Australian beer. On the 5th of May, after reporting a successful landing, the 8th Base Force redesignated the RXB force as the Yano Butai, Yoshimoto Detachment. The Azumasan Maru, which had transported the Kure 3rd SNLF from Rabaul to Tulagi on the 3rd of May, and survived the air attack of the 4th, returned to Tulagi on the 11th and docked at the 74-foot government pier. She was immediately unloaded amid bursts of rain. While the transport was dockside, another vessel arrived and began to discharge supplies onto 11 barges that shuttled between ship and shore, manned by the sailors of the Yoshimoto detachment. The Japanese were wasting no time exploiting their conquest of the island. The diary of Seaman Engineer Mori describes what was happening at Tulagi in the weeks after the Japanese takeover. On the 25th of May, 3 staff officers from Rabaul arrived by seaplane for a conference with Lieutenant Yoshimoto. They remained until the 27th. Mori writes, Lieutenant Yoshimoto called the garrison together from the steps of his home, formerly the residence of Mr. and Mrs. J.B. Hicks, next to what had been the resident commissioner's quarters. He informed the troops that in the sea battle of 7-8 of May, Battle of the Coral Sea, there was some damage to the Japanese side, but we will make a new attempt to take New Guinea and attack both Port Moresby and Fiji soon, Yoshimoto reported. Our navy sank 2 carriers, Saratoga, CV-3 and 1 other, 2 battleships, 1 American and 1 British, 1 heavy cruiser, 4 destroyers, and 2 transports, and shot down 61 enemy planes. He reminded his troops, "Today is Navy Day, a day when the Imperial Navy conquered the Russians in 1904. In honor, apples were issued and beer provided by the supervising section at dinner. A real treat." In the following days, rumours were heard of a coming Allied attempt to reoccupy the island. On the 29th of May, Mori recorded that one sea infantryman, while on pier duty at Tulagi, said that a boat came from Gavutu and warned him that an American task force was approaching the Solomons and may land at Tulagi and Gavutu on the 30th of May. At 2000, we laid sandbags at our anti-tank position. Nothing happened. On the 8th of June, the 46-man 3rd Platoon, 3rd Company, under W.O. Noboru Takeuchi, was shifted from Tulagi to Guadalcanal and designated as the RXI, Guadalcanal Airfield Support Force. It was to establish an encampment area on the grassy plains of Lunga for an inspection team from Rabaul. The Kainan Maru landed additional tents, food and supplies for the team. The Yoshimoto Company's few previous trips to Guadalcanal had been primarily to shoot cattle during food shortages. Now there were rumours of 1,000 well-armed native soldiers hidden in the impenetrable island jungle. The Kure sailors wanted no part of that. In addition, Warrant Officer Takeuchi also heard that the islanders of the Solomons were cannibalistic. The stinging debacle at Midway a few days earlier, on 3-4 of June, where the Japanese were so unquestionably defeated, had forced a new course for Imperial Navy planners. Having lost their initiative to control the Central Pacific, they began to look for new ways to solidify their gains in the South Pacific. One possibility was to construct an airfield on Guadalcanal to defend the eastern flank of Bougainville and Truk in the Caroline Islands, and to act as an outpost for the Gilbert Islands, thus protecting Rabaul. On the 19th of June, 4 officers, including Lieutenant Cedar Tokunaga Okamura from the 8th Base Force and Rear ADM, Sadayoshi Yamada, commander of the 25th Air Flotilla, left Rabaul in a Kawanishi flying boat and arrived at Gavutu at noon. At Tanambogo, they joined Captain Shigetoshi Miyazaki, commander of the Yokohama Air Group. The inspection team was tasked with investigating a site and establishing a plan for an airstrip in the open space on Guadalcanal's Longa Plains, following Miyazaki's suggestion. Okamura, commanding officer of the 13th Construction Unit, CU, would oversee the groundwork for the airstrip. Although Okamura was not an engineer, he was a skilled pilot who had been recalled from retirement specifically for this post. The inspection party stayed at the residency on Tulagi, reserved for visiting dignitaries, and enjoyed the hospitality of Lieutenant Yoshimoto. At Tulagi, they boarded Kayo Maru No. 2 for the 20-mile trip across Sea Lark Channel to Guadalcanal. They spent 2 days as guests of the Takeuchi platoon, which had set up a comfortable campsite for them. Captain Miyazaki led the team to the prairie area, having previously visited Lunga on several occasions for hunting wild cattle. After completing their survey, the team travelled back to Gavutu aboard Kayo Maru No. 2, and then boarded a flying boat for the 600-mile return trip to Rabaul. Commander Okamura was scheduled to return to Guadalcanal on the 6th of July with the advanced echelon of the 13th CU. On the 21st of June, Tomisaburo Hirai recorded the sinking of the Keijo Maru by torpedo, which was transporting supplies and rations to Tulagi from Rabaul. Seaplanes searched for survivors. At 0700 the next morning, minesweeper No. 20 returned with 62 crew members rescued on the 21st and an additional 20 to 30 on the 22nd. It was presumed that some crew members swam to nearby islands. Hirai's diary entry for the 23rd of June highlighted a food shortage on Tulagi and Gavutu. It seems we must find our own food by our own effort. We made fish nets and began fishing net style. More bad news arrived a few days later. The Yomoto Maru, en route from Rabaul to Tulagi on the 24th of June, was sunk on the 26th of June. On the 1st of July, the Kinryu Maru and the Mogamukawa Maru from Rabaul arrived at Kukum, west of Lunga on Guadalcanal, primarily to support the defence framework for the expected construction units. The Kinryu Maru carried the advance echelon of the 81st Guard Unit, including Lieutenant Yukio Endo's detachment, 8 special duty members attached to the 8th Base Force, 21 men from the 85th Communication Unit under W.O. Seiichi Sato, and 7 members of the 4th Meteorological Unit under W.O. Takezo Miyagama. Temporary reinforcements included 2 platoons of the Kure 3rd SNLF from Rabaul, totaling 103 men, and 2 civilian English-speaking interpreters, Terushigo Ishimoto and Matutaro Ito. The strength on Guadalcanal increased to 257 men, with their camp set up west of the Lungs River. The howitzer gun platoon under W.O. Tetsuzo Nakamura was assigned to Lunga Point. The 8 cm anti-aircraft guns, the first weapons ashore, were operated by untrained men in Endo's unit. The platoon also brought a 25mm anti-tank gun, 3 13mm light machine guns, and 2 6 cm Type 41 howitzers, along with ammunition. They established a Skywatcher observation post at the Central Control Station under PO3C Daisaku Miyakoshi. Despite these preparations, U.S. planes began bombing missions against the Japanese on Guadalcanal without encountering significant anti-aircraft fire. On the 2nd of July, Lieutenant Endo issued his 2nd Guadalcanal Guard Unit order to establish east and west watching posts. The following day, the Nitira Maru No. 3 arrived at Lunga with additional supplies, followed by the Hokuriku Maru, carrying the advance echelon of the 13th Construction Unit. Islanders from the Tasimboko clan assisted the Japanese in bringing supplies ashore, driven largely by curiosity. The locals had never seen such a large number of men and materiel, and helped as carriers moving oddly shaped reed containers. PO2C Sankichi Kaneda of Toyama City reported on the 3rd of July that the construction units began work on transforming a grassy field in the Lungs River right bank area into an airfield. The initial construction included a wharf, communication facilities, an electric generator building, a field kitchen, and barracks. From his coast-watching station, Martin Clemens observed the Japanese activities with frustration. His diary entry for the 4th of July detailed sightings of Japanese schooners searching for traces, and he recorded concerns about their proximity to his hideout. On the 6th of July, the main contingent of the Japanese construction groups arrived. The Guadalcanal Airfield Construction Force included two organizations: Captain Kane Monzen's 11th Construction Unit, under the Combined Fleet, Yokosuka Naval Construction Department, and Lieutenant Commander Tokunaga Okamura's 13th Construction Unit, under the 8th Fleet, Sasebo Naval Construction Department. Originally, the 13th CU was assigned to base construction for the occupation of Midway Island, while the 11th CU was tentatively assigned similar responsibilities for the FS plan, targeting Fiji, New Caledonia, and Samoa. Due to the failure of the Midway operation and logistical challenges, the FS plan was put on hold. The 11th and 13th construction units were reassigned to construct the airfield on Guadalcanal. They were supported by a chain of island airbases between Guadalcanal and Rabaul to monitor and interdict the US-Australia supply line. On the 29th of June, a 13-ship convoy carrying the 11th and 13th CUs departed Truk for the Solomons, escorted by the 6th Combat Unit, including the light cruiser Uari and destroyers Uzuki and Oite, supported by the 21st Submarine Chaser Squadron. US submarines attacked the convoy en route, sinking one destroyer and one gunboat. The Azumasan Maru, deemed the lucky ship, survived multiple torpedo attacks. Originally scheduled for the 4th of July, the Japanese landing at Guadalcanal was postponed due to sightings of a US Navy task force. The convoy changed course and finally reached the southern Solomons on the 6th of July. The Kotoku Maru carried approximately 400 construction personnel and security troops, the Kanyo Maru held 500 laborers, and the Azumasan Maru had 400. Other transports included the Mayo Maru, Matumoto Maru, and Nojima Maru, carrying various construction workers and equipment. The equipment aboard included 13 trucks, 1 road roller, sheet steel panels, 13 landing craft, 2 5-ton derricks, 2 1-ton derricks, and 3 6,000-watt generators, along with hundreds of reed baskets for moving gravel to the airfield. The fast-working crew of the Azumasan Maru unloaded first, and by the 11th of July, all vessels had offloaded and departed for Rabaul. On the 6th of July, bi-monthly visitors, Minesweeper No. 20, Destroyer Uzuki, Submarine Division 23, and the Kinryu Maru, arrived at the Tulagi Government Pier. Supplies, including hundreds of sacks of rice and extensive wireless equipment, were unloaded. A detachment of 129 laborers from the 14th Construction Unit under Lieutenant Commander Kiyoshi Ida, radar specialist Lieutenant Commander Dairoku Yokio, and a safekeeping unit under Lieutenant Commander Zaizo Nishimura disembarked with additional personnel and equipment. The following Japanese intelligence report could have informed the arriving construction troops about available resources and terrain. Dense jungle and grassy plains, except for the strip along the beach, cover all the regions of Guadalcanal untrodden by men. There are no roads, and transportation would be difficult. Generally, stored rainwater should be used for cooking. Fruit and fish are abundant. However, some fish are poisonous. Between Point Esperance and Kimbo Bay, automobile passage is possible if some construction is carried out. Between the Arulijo River and Point Esperance, although the area is temporarily suitable for the landing of heavier items, it will be necessary to improve facilities at river crossings in order to transport them inland. In the vicinity of Savaplug, the road passes at a distance from the beach to the dense jungle. East of Tassafaronga, if 5 or 6 places are repaired, automobile passage is possible and suitable for landing heavy items. The area at the foot of Mount Austin, extending in a northerly direction from the Matanikau River to the Lungs River, is composed of rolling hills. The Japanese set about altering the terrain almost immediately. On the 8th of July, from his watchpost, Martin Clemens reported that there was Enemy activity all along the coast. The grass plains are now being fired and much smoke interferes with the view. The 8th day of each month was a national holiday, commemorating the beginning of the East-West War. It was celebrated on Tulagi just as it was in Japan, with Asahi beer. The Tulagi garrison faced Japan and worshipped the emperor from afar. Clemens reported more burning the next day. On the 9th, the Kotoku Maru arrived at Guadalcanal with 250 members of the Hara construction force. The next day, 50 were dropped off at Gavutu. On the 10th, the Kiyomizu Maru, number 906, arrived off Florida Island, and the Azumasan Maru returned to Tulagi with 22 replacements from the first company, Kure 3rd SNLF. She also delivered a load of 300 shells for the Mitsuwa Butai on Gavutu, but apparently they had the wrong fuses. A message was sent from the RXB radio station at Tulagi to the base at Rabaul, code identified as RR, complaining that the fuses were limited to 4,000 meters and that the Allied bombers flew higher than that. More trouble with fuses is recorded in a 12th of July message from the Guadalcanal commander to Rabaul. RXI secret cable number 52. On the 11th of July, we received 600 shells of 8 centimeters from the Gavutu unit, but those shells had no fuses. On the 15th of July, Lieutenant J.G. Toshichi Mitsuwa left Gavutu for a conference at Rabaul. The flying boat on which he departed had just brought the commander of the newly formed 84th Guard Unit, Masaki Suzuki, who was replacing 53-year-old Lieutenant Yoshimoto. The 84th GU had been formed on the 1st of July from the elements of the Kure 3rd SNLF on Guadalcanal, 1st Company, and Tulagi. Yoshimoto was in command of the 2nd Company, 84th Guard Unit, on Tulagi only until the 15th. Also on the plane with Commander Suzuki was a medical officer, brought to perform physical examinations of men who were to be promoted, and a chief paymaster who was working on the money allotment plan to send funds to the sailors' families in Japan. On the 16th of July, Lieutenant Endo issued RXI Guard Unit, 81st GU, Secret Order No. 5. The 11th Construction Unit will start work on the airfield on 16 July. Our RXI unit has not finished the necessary mop-up operation on RXI, but we suppose there is no enemy around here. Our unit will start to guard the airfield. That same day, Endo submitted to Commander Suzuki a report for his unit, identifying personnel, progress in building several gun sites, future objectives and conditions of food supply. Specifically, Endo noted that he had no men who were experts in firing the 2 75mm anti-aircraft guns he currently had, and no one qualified to operate the stereo rangefinder. He reported that they kept a 2-month supply of food and were resorting to cultivating farm produce for fresh food. They were investigating how to catch and store the many cattle on the island and had a plan for using the special watcher boat to catch fish. On the 23rd of July, the commander of the 4th Meteorological Unit at Rabaul asked the commander of the 11th CU working on the Guadalcanal airstrip for estimates of results and charts of air currents above the runway. At about the same time, Warrant Officer Tanaka's 5th Platoon, 3rd Company, Kura 3rd SNLF, had disbanded its Gavutu camp with orders to go via Lunga to Marau Sound in southeastern Guadalcanal to establish a lookout station. Tanaka's men arrived at Lunga on the 30th of July, set up a tent camp, and began digging bomb shelters. It would not be long before the protection would be needed. SME Tomisaburo Hirai of the Tanaka platoon wrote in his diary on the 31st of July, "We started to dig shelters early in the morning, but at 0920 when I was away at headquarters, an air raid began. It was too far for me to return to our area, and I hid in a steel tub. Moments later I heard the sound of a bomb falling. No great problem. When I returned to my tent, 2050, there was another air raid. I hid in our shelter when they dropped 4 or 5 bombs at 100 meters west of here. They damaged the coconut grove. God saved our life. Thanks God. But the enemy returned again and dropped additional bombs and left by 23:05, a 3-hour raid. The 1st of August. got up at 0430. We saw a trace of last night's bombing. What a horrible sight it was. At 0630 we were told to assemble and meet the new RXI company commander, Lieutenant Akira Tanabe. He made a patriotic speech for us. He is about 28 years old, very young. That morning of the 1st of August, at 0920, the Commander-in-Chief of the 4th Fleet radioed the South Pacific Fleet. According to information received, enemy's condition is as follows. Enemy is gathering power along the east coast of Australia. You should keep close watch. In a communication also dated the 1st of August from Tokyo to Paymaster Ien's, Shinzo Nagano, the sender, informed the 11th CU that letters from the families of departed Korean construction workers, thanking the Navy for forwarding the personal effects of the deceased, should be sent to a new address. Two important changes would reshape the available combat units at Guadalcanal. First, the 8th Base Force ordered the 81st Guard Unit, RXI Dispatched Force, back to Rabaul to rejoin the parent unit. Apparently the services of Lieutenant Endo and part of his detachment were required in Rabaul. The feisty Endo, former adjutant of the Maizuru 2nd SNLF, was well known there. Terushige Ishimoto and Matutaro Ito, the civilian interpreters attached to the Navy and members of the 81st GU, remained on Guadalcanal. It was anticipated that the newly reformed 84th Guard Unit would assume security for Guadalcanal and the airfield. Endo left behind Warrant Officer Nakamura's howitzer gun platoon to bolster the 84th GU, as well as some men from his unit who were manning lookout stations on the island. Endo's force, including the 1st Platoon under W.O. Takezo Hasegawa and the Command Platoon under W.O. Kimihide Seki, departed longer for New Britain Island on the 2nd of August in the Kinryu Maru. The 600-mile journey normally took only 28 to 30 hours, but on this voyage the Kinryu Maru proceeded at a reduced speed to allow the sailors to take and record depth soundings from the New Georgia and Bougainville areas all the way back to Rabaul, and thus she did not arrive until the 7th of August. The other significant change at Guadalcanal was the departure of the Tanaka platoon of 38 from Lunga for Morao Sound, along with 2 radio operators and a boat crew of 12 with interpreter Ishimoto. They travelled in the Kaio Maru No. 1 and Kaio Maru No. 2. After establishing a watch post at Morao Sound, Tanaka was to move over to Malaita Island and set up another lookout post called Zero at Nialahau Point, Cape Zeli. Tanaka's group reached the Morao Sound area on the 4th of August, but Kaio Maru No. 1 hit a partially submerged sandbar, and there she remained. On the 5th of August, 3 officers from the Yokohama Air Group Flying Boat Unit at Tanambogo, Captain Shigetoshi Miyazaki, Lieutenant Sida Saburo Katsuda, and Lieutenant Sida Takayuki Kurosaki, visited the officers of the 11th CU at the Guadalcanal airstrip. They told them that the 25th Air Flotilla would arrive at Guadalcanal from Rabaul not later than the 8th of August. After staying part of the day, the 3 men were satisfied that work on the airfield was on schedule, and they returned by launch to Tanambogo. The 2 major construction units laboured in 2 shifts, night and day, on the Guadalcanal airstrip. They worked at opposite ends, moving toward the middle, with mostly shovels and pickaxes and bicycle carts to transport the dirt and rock they dug. At the same time, workers were building the base, including a truck pool, power and refrigeration facilities, and 3 wooden warehouses west of the Lunga River. The beach at Kukum was fitted with cranes, a small marine railway, and a pier for unloading lighters, the flat-bottomed barges used to transport materiel relatively short distances. A bridge was thrown across the Lunga River, and a dirt road for trucks was completed from Kukum across the bridge to the airfield. The island headquarters was erected of prefabricated lumber in the Levers Plantation's coconut grove just north of the field. Meanwhile, quarters for the protection forces were put up east and west of Lunga Lagoon. Labourer Masato Shinoda would write in his diary, August 1st. I worked hard all day with 3 other fellows. There was an air raid during lunch. I grabbed my food and ran away. August 2nd. We carried sheet iron, roofing in the car truck all day. It was really hard work and very exhausting. There were 2 air raids. I had to flee with my lunch. Some 50 bombs fell on the airfield. No damage. On the night of the 6th of August, construction of the Guadalcanal Air Base was almost on schedule. PO2 C. Sankichi Kaneda, Nakamura Platoon, 81st Guard Unit, wrote the following in his memoirs. 4 August. The first stage of construction on the runway is completed, 60 m wide and 800 m long. It is ready for fighter plane takeoffs and landings. 5 August. Guadalcanal Guard Unit sent an urgent request to the 8th Base Force to send airplanes, but the opinion at the highest levels of command at that time was that the enemy would not mount a serious counterattack until 1943, so the request was denied. At 1940, on the 6th, the 8th Communication Unit dispatched a message from the commander of the 8th Base Force to the commander of the 84th Guard Unit, classified Gunji Gokuhi, top secret. The 8th Commander wanted the balance of the 81st Keibutai, 81st Guard Unit, withdrawn soon, though because the conditions were increasing the probability of danger, he acknowledged that the withdrawal should be postponed. He requested that the 84th GU commander confirm whether or not the Mitsuwa anti-aircraft unit at Gavutu was included in the 25th of July list of men in the 84th GU. By the time the message was received, however, Endo's force almost had reached Rabaul. Apparently, Rabaul headquarters sensed that something was going to happen in the Guadalcanal area, though what or when was not known. When Lieutenant Endo's force arrived at the Rabaul dock at 0810 on the 7th of August, the dockmaster shouted to the seamen on deck, "Guadalcanal was attacked by the Americans, and Tulagi was invaded." Endo was furious and ran to the naval headquarters a short distance away to organize an immediate strike force to counter the Americans. His former outfit, the Maizuru 2nd SNLF, had taken Wake Island from the U.S. Marines that past December, and Endo thought that he could do it again on Guadalcanal. A hastily assembled force of 519 Rikusentai, drawn from the Sasebo 5th SNLF, the 81st GU, and the Kure 3rd SNLF, boarded the transports Mayo Maru and Kankoku for the Solomons. They were escorted by coastal mine layer Tsugaru No. 21 and submarine chaser No. 26. The Mayo Maru never made it. On the night of the 8th, she was sunk by a torpedo from the U.S. submarine S-38 under Lieutenant Seadier Henry G. Munson. The escorts picked up 177 survivors. Lieutenant Endo was not among them. Anyone who believes that the U.S. Marine invasion caught the Japanese completely by surprise is mistaken. The 8th Base Force had been alerted that something was afoot, but it had neglected to adequately brief the Tulagi and Guadalcanal garrisons of its suspicions. The Japanese had been diligently sending their flying boats off each morning about 0700 on reconnaissance surveys over assigned tracts of the Pacific Ocean. Their normal schedule called for a 3-plane unit to fly a pattern 400 miles in a southeasterly direction. On the 6th of August, however, the Kawanishi flying boats remained tied to their moorings in Gavutu harbour because of atmospheric conditions and the misty cloud cover that blanketed the area. Had the weather been clear, the U.S. invasion fleet would have been spotted and its 19 transports and their precious cargo put in jeopardy. The struggle for Guadalcanal would have had a different beginning, perhaps even a different ending, but fate chose to favour the Allies that day. That evening, an immense Emily flying boat landed at Gavutu harbour, bringing some sorely needed oil for the Kawanishi. Aboard was Lieutenant Sida Noboru Sato on an inspection trip to the advance base. A party was held in his honour at the Keisan Unit Club on Gavutu, a former RAAF building, with beer, sake, and much storytelling and entertainment. Around 2100, before the reception was over, the radio watch clerks reported receiving numerous unusual radio signals from the enemy. Excitement in the camp ran high. All Air Group personnel were put on immediate alert. Captain Shigetoshi Miyazaki decided to extend the normal search pattern to 600 miles. MCPO Masaichiro Miyagawa was placed on watch duty, from 0200 to 0600. Meanwhile, the maintenance crews performed last-minute checks of the Kawanishi that were riding at anchor 80 to 150 yards off Gavutu, with fuel tanks that had been topped off the day before. The pilots were awake at 0300, and within 45 minutes they reached the ramp area and were ferried to their planes. They warmed up their engines by taxiing about in Gavutu harbour, their blue and white guidance lights flickering. Pio Kyosho Mutu was at the controls of his flying boat, waiting patiently for the signal to take off. Lieutenant Sida Soichi Tashiro, third in command of the air unit, was making his final instrument adjustments. When the green takeoff signal flare was fired, the Kawanishi jockeyed into position. Then at Tanambogo headquarters, the telephone rang. It was Tulagi. The caller yelled, "Kushuke hot! Air raid!" Master Chief Petty Officer Miyagawa, at his lookout perch, could not hear any engines, but glancing in the direction of Guadalcanal, he could see numerous black dots approaching Gavutu, like swarming bees. A mass of attackers from the U.S. Navy aircraft carriers Wasp, CV-7, and Enterprise, CV-6, 16 fighters, 24 dive bombers, and 1 torpedo bomber struck the three-island complex, overwhelming the flying boats before they could get airborne. The fully fueled planes became flaming pyres, spurting burning gasoline that saturated the area. Fuel drenched the grey rubber boats used to ferry crews to the Kawanishis. When hit, they too burst into flames, the occupants burning as they dove or were hurled into the water. Few escaped the inferno. It was a horrifying sight, Miyagawa recalled. Ends. Raymond F. Conklin, a pilot from U.S. Navy Fighting Squadron VF-71 aboard the Wasp who attacked flying boats off Macambo, commented that one of his victims flamed so fast that it was like flying through a prairie fire. Having devastated the flying boats, the F-4F Wildcats of VF-71 went on to deal with the fighter component of the Yokohama Air Group, the 7 war-painted Zero floatplanes, roofs, based at Halavo on Florida Island. Coming in at only 50 feet off the water, 2 fighter divisions took the roofs under fire. They sank immediately. Another division clobbered Haleta village, where the U.S. Marines would go ashore 2 hours later. The attack was over within minutes. Nothing was left of the Yokohama Air Group. Lieutenant Commander Katsuda was overheard saying, "All prizes and honours of our air group have been lost." Lieutenant Commander Sato, who had arrived for an inspection the day before, was found dead on Gavutu, apparently by concussion, for there was not a scratch on him. Reveille on Tulagi was at 0400 each day. Morning worship began at 0415 and ended at 0440. Breakfast was ready 20 minutes later. Work normally began at 0630. This had been the routine on the 7th of August, except that Commander Suzuki and Lieutenant Yoshimoto were sleeping later. At 0610, the explosion of shells on nearby Florida Island abruptly awakened them. Partially dressed, they headed for the limestone caves located not far from their command post at a hill near the former government station. Lieutenant Yoshimoto, who was very much afraid of air attacks, in anticipation had the Rikusentai excavate dugouts and caverns throughout the lower end of the island. That early August morning, others running for the shelters included Medical Officer Lieutenant Ryoichi Chadani and Supply Officer Lieutenant Ko Nomura. Almost instantly, the bombardment shifted to Tulagi, tearing up the moss-green ground cover and blasting the beautiful bougainvilleas that adorned the residency grounds. The caves that had provided safe haven many times during air raids in the last 3 months now did so again. But this time the salvos from the enemy warships made everyone jittery, wondering if they would be invaded. PO3 C. Osamu Yamaoka of the Tulagi Radio Communications Section had been on duty when at 0600 a runner alerted him that a group of strange ships had been seen near Savo Island. As others crowded into the radio shack, a hurried message was sent off to Rabaul. From Commander, Tulagi Communications Base. To Commander, 8th Base Force. 20 vessels, enemy surface force attacking RXB by air raid, preparing to land. Further messages of increasing urgency followed. 0630, Tulagi reported, all seaplanes on fire. 0635, enemy mobile force sighted. 0715, enemies commenced landing on Tulagi. 0725, enemies commenced landing on RXB. 2 minutes later, the 8th Base Force radioed, when required, set fire to equipment. 0729. Tulagi replied, situation requires setting fire to equipment immediately. The invasion and supporting bombardment were overwhelming. 0730, Tulagi reported, receiving naval gunfire. 0749, enemies both shelling and beginning disembarkation. 0800, 1 battleship, 3 cruisers, 15 destroyers plus transports. 0810. On the 7th of August, the Tulagi Communications Base radioed the 8th Base Force for the last time. Enemy strength great, defending to the last. May the fortunes of war be with you. Commander Suzuki's Defense Plan Commander Suzuki, who had been on Tulagi for only 3 weeks, studied the defense plan drawn up by Lieutenant Yoshimoto. However, the strategy drafted in May was outdated by August, so Suzuki had to improvise. Suzuki ordered one part of the 4th Platoon, under W.O. Fukimoto, to take up positions in the government wharf area. The headquarters unit, under W.O. Takeo Ikeda, and the command platoon, under W.O. Tsurusaburo Shigeta, covered the sector between the Residency and Sasapi. Half of the 1st Platoon, under W.O. Yoshiharu Muranaka, stationed in the hospital area, was adjacent to PO3 Harubumi Ishida's 2nd Squad of the 2nd Platoon, under W.O. Sadayuki Kato, which was guarding Chinatown. The lines were stretched thin. Suzuki had a total of about 175 effective troops from his 4 platoons. Most of his 2nd Platoon was on lookout duty on Florida Island, while the other half of his 1st Platoon was garrisoning Malaita. On Guadalcanal, 38 men from the 5th Platoon, under W.O. Kikuo Tanaka, were on detached service at Morao Sound, and W.O. Noboru Takauchi's 3rd Platoon of 46 was attached to the newly formed 1st Company, 84th Guard Unit at Lunga. Takeuchi had 10 men on observation duty off Banica in the Russell Islands. The strength of the Japanese defence on Tulagi lay in the 1st and 4th Platoons, which were reinforced by the headquarters unit and 36 men from the command platoon, functioning as a FL OTA unit, moving around the island as needed. Part of this force was the original machine gun company of the Kure 3rd SNLF, now the 2nd Company, 84th Guard Unit, providing Suzuki with substantial firepower. Normally, Suzuki had a squad stationed at the commanding hill 281, Bird Hill, with sentries on duty around the clock in 6 shifts of 4 hours each. Other guards, also in 6 shifts, were stationed at the government pier, the wireless station, and the east end of the prison. In terms of ordnance, Commander Suzuki had 5 automatic rifles, 2 at the foot of Bird Hill behind the hospital, 2 near the harbour close to the former post office building, and 1 on top of Bird Hill. 2 light machine guns, 1 in Chinatown, and 1 near the hospital. 2 8mm anti-aircraft guns on top of the southeast promontory of Bird Hill. 2 13mm machine guns, and 3 anti-tank rapid-firing guns in various parts of the defence zone. 12 grenade launchers. The key defensive position was Bird Hill, which had the most concentrated firepower of the 84th Guard Unit. Standing orders to Lieutenant Mitsuwa, whose men on Gavutu had 13mm and 25mm machine guns, were to fire when he thought it would be an effective deterrent against any landing forces. Supplementing the defenders were 185 personnel from the construction detachments, under Lieutenant Sida Kiyoshi Iida, 50 non-combatants from the 7th Construction Unit, 129 men from the 14th Construction Unit, and 6 men from the 13th Construction Unit. The 14th EU, awaiting replacement by the 15th Construction Unit, a new force of 300 men, was scheduled to be transferred to Lae, New Guinea. Also still at his post was the ill-starred 53-year-old Lieutenant Yoshimoto, who was being replaced by Commander Suzuki and was to be released into retirement. Yoshimoto was scheduled to leave Tulagi on the 8th of August aboard the Nichiran Maru. When their dull routine was shattered on the 7th of August by American shells, the sentries on Tulagi were unaware of a great Allied armada at their doorstep. They had known something was amiss because the flying boats had been churning the water since early that morning, but no one from the air group had informed the garrison commander of their suspicions. The Kura men and the construction workers remained in the caves and air raid shelters until about noon. Around 12:07 that midday, the Rikusentai shifted to form a line across Tulagi's eastern slopes and ravines. There, Suzuki's non-seagoing sailors would wait for the U.S. Marines to show them their fighting abilities. A Joint Chiefs of Staff (JCS) directive approved by President Roosevelt on the 30th of March 1942 divided the Pacific Theater into three parts: Pacific Ocean Area (POA), Southwest Pacific Area (SWPA), and Southeast Pacific Area (SEPA). The Pacific Ocean Area was divided into the North Pacific Area (NPA), Central Pacific Area (CPA), and South Pacific Area (SPA). The South Pacific Area included every Pacific Ocean Area landmass south of the equator, except the Phoenix Islands. The Southwest Pacific Area included the Bismarck Archipelago, New Guinea, and the Solomon Islands. General Douglas MacArthur was appointed Supreme Commander, Allied Forces, Southwest Pacific Area, CNC-SWPA, and ADM, Chester W. Nimitz, Commander-in-Chief, Pacific Ocean Area, CINC-POA. Nimitz was given command of the North Pacific Area and Central Pacific Area, but was directed by ADM. Ernest J. King, Commander-in-Chief, U.S. Fleet, Cominch, to appoint Vice ADM. Robert L. Gormley as Commander for the South Pacific Area. On the 18th of April, Admiral King ordered Gormley to establish his headquarters in Auckland, New Zealand, with an advance base in Tongatabu, Tonga. Gormley arrived at his headquarters in Auckland on the 22nd of May. On the 2nd of July 1942, the Joint Chiefs of Staff, JCS, issued the Directive for Offensive Operations in the Southwest Pacific Area, which led to the invasion of the British Solomon Islands by the 1st Marine Division, reinforced by elements of the 2nd Marine Division. In January 1942, the 2nd Marine Brigade had deployed to the Samoan Islands as reinforcements, and the U.S. Army and Navy occupied Bora Bora in the Society Islands, where the Navy constructed a fuel tank farm to support fleet operations. Other task forces occupied the Phoenix and Fiji Islands. On the 12th of March, Army Task Force, ATF, 6,814 landed at Noumea, New Caledonia, codenamed White Poppy, and in May ATF 051 garrisoned Tonga, codenamed Bleacher. The next jump was 400 miles from New Caledonia to Efate Island, New Hebrides, where ATF 6,814 Detachment A landed at Port Vila. 2 months later, the small task force moved 100 miles west to Espiritu Santo Island, also in the New Hebrides group. The Japanese were not idle. They occupied Rabaul on New Britain Island on the 23rd of January, and by March they were in Lai, New Guinea, and the Shortland Islands in the Northern Solomons. While the Americans moved west, the Japanese moved east. In May, the Japanese Special Landing Party captured Tulagi Island, the capital of the British Solomon Islands, while seaplane units moved into Florida, Gavutu, and Tanambogo Islands. To prevent the Japanese from expanding farther east, the U.S. Navy planned to establish stepping stone bases on key islands in the South Seas. The immediate objective was the occupation of Ndeni, codenamed Apricot, the main island in the Santa Cruz group, codenamed Cyanide, located 335 nautical miles east-southeast of Guadalcanal. The reinforced 2nd Marines on the U.S. West Coast were the most readily available unit for the task. The Joint Chiefs of Staff planned to assign the 1st Marine Division, reinforced, to the Ndeni-Tulagi operation. The 2nd Marines were to assault Ndeni, 335 miles from the general target area. Guadalcanal, codenamed Cactus, was not part of the original 2nd of July directive. It was later added when an enemy airstrip was reported being constructed. The South Pacific Area, SPA, did not have sufficient combat aircraft or support units to conduct both operations simultaneously. Moreover, it lacked the required stocks of war material and support facilities for a protracted minor war, much less a major one. The U.S. Navy had secured small advance bases in the South Seas since January 1942, but all were rudimentary. Rear ADM. John S. McCain's Chief of Staff noted, "Everything they eat, everything they wear, every place they live has to be brought from the U.S. There are no dock facilities, no cranes, and very poor beaches for landing craft. Heavy engineering equipment must be brought ashore so that you can build needed facilities. Everything has to be man-handled." The ultimate objective of the United States, code-named Pestilence, was the seizure and occupation of the New Britain, New Ireland, New Guinea area to deny it to Japan. The operation plan divided Pestilence into 3 phases or tasks. Task 1, the seizure and occupation of the Santa Cruz Islands, Tulagi, and adjacent positions. Task 2, the seizure and occupation of the rest of the Solomon Islands, Ley, and Salamaua, and the northeast coast of New Guinea. Task 3, the seizure and occupation of Rabaul and adjacent positions in the New Guinea, New Ireland area. Task 1, Operation Watchtower, was tentatively scheduled for the 1st of August 1942, but was later changed to the 7th of August. The boundary between the SPA and the Southwest Pacific Area, SWPA, was moved westward by 1 degree of longitude, placing the entire Task 1 target area, Santa Cruz Islands, Tulagi, Gavutu, Tanambogo, Florida, Guadalcanal, Malaita, San Cristobal, and the Russell Islands, in the British Solomon Islands, in the SPA under Vice Admiral Gormley. In brief, the target area was reassigned from General MacArthur's command in the SWPA to Vice Admiral Gormley's command.